Judges, would you please introduce yourselves?
Certainly. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Scott Barnhart. I'm currently in Indianapolis, Indiana. I'm an attorney that works at the Indiana Attorney General's office. I work in the Consumer Protection Division where I'm Chief Counsel and Director. And I'm very much looking forward to hearing what you have to say today.
I'm Marcia Holland. I'm an attorney in Missoula, Montana. Most of my legal career as a practicing attorney was as a career public defender in Fairbanks, Alaska. But when I moved back to Montana, I started teaching at the law school here. So last week, I just finished my 9th Zoom mock trials. So I'm so thrilled that the center could allow us to continue this virtual competition. I look forward to hearing from you.
Good afternoon. My name is Becca Steinhoff. I am joining today from Casper, Wyoming. I am the executive director of the John P. L. Bogan Foundation, which is a private family foundation that carries out grant making just in the state of Wyoming. And I will add that I am also looking forward to hearing from you. So thanks for being here, and we'll get going.
You can introduce yourselves.
Good afternoon. We are Foothill High School's Unit 6, representing the state of California. My name is Luke Ritchie.
My name is Ali Lamb.
And my name is Robert Gann. We would like to thank the judges, audience, and timekeeper for being here today, and we would like to introduce our coaches, Mr. McBride, Mr. Dedamore, and Mr. Constantelos.
Thank you. All right, I will read the question and give you time for your opening statement. President Eisenhower said we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence by the military-industrial complex. The potential for disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. Do you agree or disagree? Why? What disagreements do the founders have about a standing army? Are they relevant today? To what extent should there be an international U.S. military presence? You may begin.
The military-industrial complex functions through a revolving door between private and public leadership, campaign contributions, and lobbying efforts, meaning that it operates at the expense of those underneath. We agree with President Eisenhower's warning of misplaced power because of two main factors: the undue dominance it gives to corporations domestically and the destructive militarism it necessitates.
Lobbyists and defense industry insiders consistently occupy prominent government positions, such as Defense Secretaries Lloyd Austin, Mark Esper, and James Mattis. And military spending is regularly made a top priority. For example, defense occupies over half of the Biden administration's $1.5 trillion budget request. We agree with Brown professor Heidi Peltier, who attributes these costs to payments of overly expected military contractors and claims that their extreme profitability negatively impacts U.S. labor markets.
To maintain demand for these contractors, we are pressured into destructive warfare with a cost too often ignored: non-American lives. According to a Brown University study, direct war deaths of America's post-9/11 wars include 536 journalists, 807 humanitarian workers, and up to 335,000 other civilians, numbers that easily dwarf deaths of enemy combatants.
But the full extent of all of this can't be neatly quantified. Corporate influence in any form thrives when hiding from the public eye, and the scope of the defense industry is broader than defense budgets alone. Abroad, the secretive nature of drone warfare makes death tolls difficult to fully compile, let alone consequences such as damage to infrastructure. But what we do know is that the institution Eisenhower referred to has resulted in some of the deadliest policies in American history.
This concern with an excessive military goes back to America's conception. While the founders agreed that defense was needed, what should comprise it and when should it engage? James Madison, Samuel Adams, and many colonists strongly opposed a federal standing army, still remembering the impressive British Empire. At the 1787 Constitutional Convention, Madison even stated that the means of defense against foreign danger have always been the instruments of tyranny at home.
Though today, Pew Research reports that 80% of Americans trust the military, the founders' concerns remain relevant. Their fears have been realized in events like the Kent State Massacre or the clearing of Lafayette Square just last summer, both instances in which the U.S. National Guard has used force against civilians.
On the other hand, Alexander Hamilton supported a standing army, claiming in Federalist 25 that the Constitution could shield against its potential evils and that a militia would take too long to form in times of crises, as seen with Shays' Rebellion in 1786. Additionally, Hamilton cites that the burden to contribute to a state-led force would unevenly fall on larger states like New York, ending in a rivalry within the Union. With novel military technology and bloated budgets, we've created a force of Adams' worst nightmare.
These concerns only grow when examining international influence, which now defines America's exorbitant military activity. We believe the U.S. should decrease the extent of its influence worldwide, as we cannot reliably be omniscient and righteous in our interventions. And we believe that citing possible conflicts rather than real ones, like Cold War-era domino theory, is not proper justification for war.
Beyond direct involvement in war, we must also decrease indirect military influence, such as weapons sales, which presidents regularly use to stoke violence in their interests. The only way Congress can stop such deals is if both chambers vote against it, a check difficult to rely on with ubiquitous partisan ties and patronage systems.
We propose making only one chamber's vote no enough to prevent weapons sales. This would ensure more caution and deliberation, which must underlie our discourse instead of profit, when the U.S. exacts its most rapid and potentially damaging form of change. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to switch focus a little bit away from missiles and tanks and hardware kind of military support to the fact that war changes, and it's more likely now that it will be a cyber attack. It's shutting down the NASDAQ or Wall Street, or as we've seen, interfering with elections. Do you think that the current military makeup is proficient at dealing with the ever-changing face of war?
I personally would say that the U.S. would be very well prepared to respond to such a threat, given the fact that large corporations such as big tech would definitely play a large role in defending against these threats. And while they may not be recognized as an actual part of the military-industrial complex, they are still definitely part of the Iron Triangle, a connection between Congress, lobbyists, and the industries that hire them, in which these corporations build a very strong socioeconomic relationship with the government and the activities that they enact.
Thanks.
And I would respectfully disagree with my unit mate here and say that while the US does have this force of big tech that is definitely strong, as seen with the cyber attacks on our election in 2016, that's been proven from factories in Russia that were interfering. I would say that we aren't fully equipped to block out all of these threats. In addition to Russia, we look to China, which has an increasingly secretive and strong military force abroad and like physically and online.
Thank you.
You alluded to the influence that lobbying has in this military complex and also just in the mention of the Iron Triangle. So to what degree do you think that lobbying should or should not be limited as it relates to the influence that it has on Congress?
So we see that, as stated in Article 1, Section 8, Congress does have a large concentration of these use of military power. And a way that this is connected to corporations and lobbying is, for example, we look at Mac Thornberry, of representative from Texas, who from 2013 to 2014, Lockheed Martin was his top donor, which later benefited the corporation because he was helping to push through legislation that would purchase a large amount of arms sales for the US government, which is clearly tied to Congress. And so these connections, I would say we have to be very cautious and would, to solve them, would maybe pass a bill that would separate these corporations from what are supposed to be representatives looking out for the common good.
I would say that rather than looking to specific bills or tweaks to the system in order to limit the power of lobbying, we would need to see this come from outside of those structures that have been corrupted, and would point to something like the massive mobilization against the Vietnam War, in which activists of all stripes, including Story and Howard Zinn, were mobilizing in various ways, including selectively withholding which taxes they would pay that were contributing to the war effort. And we saw that having that kind of popular action with a material impact was essential for resisting that kind of war and militarism, more so than any restrictions Congress would place on itself.
Thank you.
So if we were to retract the military, either physically in terms of the number of folks or financially in terms of the amount that we spend in our $1.5 trillion budget, what impact would that have on the rest of the world and the world's view of the United States as a superpower?
There are many different possible ways to react to this. Of course, we are going to acknowledge that our opponents, such as Russia and China, will definitely see this as an advantage. For example, China's plans for 2049, as outlined by their government, aims to overtake the United States military by that time period. And so while we agree that inherent danger may be relevant when decreasing our military, we would argue that to our allies and to many countries who have been the victim of U.S. military interventions in the past, it might be reassuring to see that the United States is becoming a more mature and restrained force and is looking for more diplomatic ways to influence the global community rather than militarily, which has too long defined our international relations.
I would echo my unit mate's sentiment, particularly regarding the idea of focusing on diplomacy rather than militarism, and say that a world superpower which is built on imperialist practices rather than diplomatic ones is going to be one that acquires enemies as it goes along, whether it's backing military coups, such as routinely happens in Latin America, or military intervention for financial gain, as we've seen in the Middle East. This is something that fosters extremist radicalization in those areas and tends to destabilize them and create more enemies, which is detrimental for everyone in the world stage.
So let me ask you this. How many military bases do we need in the United States and globally? Do we have too many, too few, or the right number?
I'd say that overall, we would say we have too many. When we look at wars that have been prolonged, such as the US presence in Korea or the 20-year war in Afghanistan, the sheer amount of resources we're pouring into having boots on the ground in those countries are just simply too much. While the troops there certainly may be providing some security to the US, these wars that have been prolonged for just such long amounts of time have ultimately just used up a lot of resources and maybe not been the best way to go about conflicts between, for example, Afghanistan and the US.
I would point especially to the fact that there are over 800 military bases in hundreds of countries, and that the statistics such as how the U.S. has not lifted soldiers out of Germany since the end of World War II. I would say that the extreme presence of military bases is an impractical and unnecessary extension of military force, drawing from the opinion that Princeton professor Robert Keohane wrote that the U.S. is impractical for the U.S. to maintain the amount of interest that it used to during the Cold War in regions that are now developed and no longer that volatile.
Thank you.
You mentioned increasing diplomacy or using diplomacy as a first attempt for some of this work. Do you see a trade-off between reducing the military and increasing diplomacy capacity or infrastructure? Or is the United States prepared with its current infrastructure for diplomacy to carry out a stronger role?
I would say, go ahead, Ali.
I wouldn't say that necessarily we see this as a end-all solution. While we would advocate for increasing diplomacy, I think that the main reason we would advocate for this is simply because the $753 billion budget we have right now is simply too much to pour into the force. So while we would additionally add and tack on diplomacy, this wouldn't be really a fixer to, may I finish my thought, to our overall problem of this exorbitant military budget.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, give some feedback. Well done. First of all, nice job. I really appreciate your sort of use or pointing to exact numbers in the budget and kind of formulating your responses and comments around that, right? So it's easy to talk in abstract discussions, but really pulling out the concrete facts, I think, is helpful for your argument. I also, first time we've heard Kent State today as an example, which is a really good one, right? So we look at and say, oh, okay, the military is helping out with the vaccine, helping out with other things. but Kent State is one example that it didn't work out that well. I also appreciated your roadmap in your opening statements, and also the ability for you to present solutions, right? So coming up with, okay, we can, talk about what's bad about it and talk about why we disagree, but coming up with solutions is really a constructive way of addressing this. And I certainly appreciate that view and that perspective. So thank you for the discussion. Well done.
Thanks. I like when language gives me a really clear visual of the point you're trying to make, and the concept of a revolving door, where there's always this interconnection between Congress, lobbyists, and the military. I thought that was a very effective way to begin your prepared remarks. And as Scott mentioned, I liked the roadmap, the 2 main points you wanted to make in your main presentation. And then I liked the fact that you talked about contractors. There's pros and cons about using contractors. And, it would have been interesting to hear some more of the pros, but you certainly identified some of the reasons why there are contractors. So I really appreciate that depth of knowledge. And thank you very much for your presentation.
I would echo a lot of what has already been said. And even though it's been said, I feel like I should also say I liked this visual of the revolving door. I think that was a really smart way to start, and then talk about some of your argument that followed. And so that was a powerful visual and a good way to begin. That was, you connected throughout your prepared remarks, which I thought created just a strong sense of coherence. You have obviously done a lot of research. You have quite the depth and breadth of knowledge as it relates to an issue that's really quite dynamic. And this question is very broad. And so it's easy to look at just parts of what might connect here, but you've done a lot of work to really try and capture and wrap your minds around how big of an issue this is. And then that showed up especially as you provided strong evidence and context, both in your prepared remarks and into the answers that you provided to questions. So overall, you have given us much to think about, and we always appreciate that insight and perspective. You did a wonderful job preparing and executing the use of your knowledge here today. So thank you. Well done.